This is your host, Stephen Sargeant. We were lucky enough to pull one of the best people for product management at Aptos blockchain that's handling everything payments, stablecoin. We have Emilio Coello. He takes years of experience working for one of the largest LATAM crypto exchanges at Bitso, where he was doing regulatory and policy work. And he's now building the features that we're seeing at one of the fastest blockchains out there, the Aptos blockchain. He's talking all about payments, what makes Aptos such a competitive advantage over some of the other L1 blockchains, some of the interesting things that they're building, especially around financial institutions and TradFi, getting into the digital asset space. We touch a little bit on DeFi, a little bit on RWA. We spend a lot of time talking about on-chain compliance, regulatory requirements. This is such an amazing episode. You very rarely get to talk to product people about what's driving this stablecoin adoption and crypto payments around the world. And we are lucky enough to bring them on the Around the Coin. And I know you're going to enjoy this podcast. Stay tuned, love it, like it, and let me know what you think, or if you have any questions on who our next guest should be. Talk soon. This is your host, Stephen Sargeant, the Around the Coin podcast. We have Emilio Coello. He's a product manager handling everything payments at Aptos Labs. Emilio, welcome to the pod.
Thank you so much, Stephen. It's exciting to be here. Thank you for having me.
Can you share a little bit about your background? I want to talk actually because you've been in crypto very early, since 2017. You've been working on some interesting positions, but one of those was like before crypto was the advisor to the Minister of Finance and Public Credit, and that was, I believe, in Mexico City. Can you share a little bit about what you were working on? Was there any discussions around fintech or open banking or digital assets technology back at that time?
I love that question. I was not expecting it, but actually the response, the very quick answer is yes. Back when I was working in the minister's team, there was a fintech law being enacted. It was being drafted by Congress, the Senate, and the Ministry of Finance. So I had an opportunity of reviewing what the fintech framework, basically regulating two structures, which were e-money institutions and crowdfunding. And digital assets was going to fall under that regulatory structure. That's the first time I got to see from a first lens what regulation was going to look like for Mexico. And this was all being drafted, negotiated between the private sector, public sector. And when I joined my first crypto company in 2018, the framework came into existence. It was enacted, approved by Congress, by Senate. So it gave me a very good opportunity of understanding what was going to happen and how we were going to have to deal with trying to become one of the first licensed crypto companies in the country.
We hear a lot about Argentina, Brazil, especially with some of their emerging regulations. Where do you think Mexico has landed over the last almost decade since enacting some of those rules and, guidelines and guardrails that they were back then to where they land now, when it comes to digital assets in the LATAM region?
So Mexico was very forward thinking in 2018 when they were thinking about creating this regulatory structure for digital assets. There was some complexities with the secondary regulation that the central bank sort of implemented that sort of restricted the overall applicability of the framework for digital asset companies. And at the same time, you had the Financial Action Task Force releasing some of their recommendations for how to regulate and treat virtual asset service providers. So this was all happening in 2018, 2019, and most of the countries in Latin America and the region were very behind thinking, like, how are we actually going to implement this? And I think what quickly happened is that they realized there was a competitive advantage on having virtual asset service provider friendly frameworks. So a lot of countries started to implement the vast framework for registering the operations of entities that were dealing with digital assets. So a lot of countries very quickly caught up to speed. Mexico was forward thinking at its time. But then I think, as you mentioned, Argentina, Colombia, Brazil, they all did a huge effort in making sure they had either sandboxes, regulatory environments, frameworks that were going to allow for entrepreneurs to start creating companies that were going to deal with that. And we're talking 2019, 2020, 2021. I mean, it's still not as friendly as the USA has become, or Europe, with the clarity that some of the newer frameworks have given, but it's getting there.
Well, it took USA a long time too, so Mexico shouldn't really worry, considering FinCEN was already considering pretty much crypto companies needing to do AML from 2015 and onward. You spent a fair time at Bitso, which is one of the largest exchanges in Latin America. What were some of you were working the regulatory side, the policy side. What were some of the challenges, especially because you saw the emergence of these regulations from the public sector side? What were some of the challenges and hurdles that you dealt with while you were focused on stablecoins over the last 3 years before you moved to Aptos?
So when I first joined Bitso, it was very unclear what the difference was going to be for operating the local fiat operations of an entity and the crypto operations of an entity. And that very nuanced relationship between crypto assets and fiat assets, which are very common now, right? Exchanges everywhere in the world have like this fiat pairs against crypto and like how you treat crypto. And that was very, very unclear. So we had to have hundreds of conversations with regulators, the central bank, the local securities regulator, the Ministry of Finance, on how we were planning on structuring that, how we were planning on making sure that we were going to be able to comply with the requirements that financial regulation had, even though there was not necessarily a sui generis regulation for crypto assets. It was kind of complicated. So navigating that was extremely complicated, tiring, and there was a lot of back and forth. And we were not even dealing with stablecoins back then. Like if you remember, when stablecoins really started taking off was around 2020, 2021, when the market cap of Tether and USDC started to increase. But before that, we were dealing with assets like Bitcoin, XRP, Ethereum. And then when stablecoins start to play a more important role, it started to become a little bit clearer for regulators how to start treating some of those assets. So the job became a little bit easier because regulators understood better what type of things mattered. For example, the reserve backing of the assets, how you were going to be managing those reserves, publishing attestation reports. And it was easier for them to understand the type of operations you were doing when it meant you were dealing with a stablecoin directly. So,
and I think stablecoins have kind of evolved, right? There was such a bad reputation around stablecoins and what was backed by Tether, and then you had the Terra Luna debacle. So stablecoins, just like any other digital asset, went through its ups and downs. And I think once you start looking at it from the other side and seeing that, a lot of this, investment in stablecoins into things like digital treasury bills, etc. If I had to, before we get into Aptos, I'd love to ask our guests, give me the lay of the land. Like you're on stage right now at the biggest crypto and regulatory conference in the world. What is your state of crypto payments and stablecoins that you see as of today before we go into 2026?
Well, what I'm seeing right now, 2025, is that we're crossing trillions in volume on stablecoins only, which is very, very impressive, right? Like stablecoin volume is competing against the volumes that we see in card networks, that we see in local payment systems. And the market cap has exploded to 250 billion plus in supply. So what I think is going to continue happening is, one, those volumes are just going to continue to grow exponentially as more and more institutions start to adopt stablecoins. Two is market cap is going to continue increasing. And I have a very strong thesis that non-USD stablecoins, backed by other fiat currencies, are going to become the connectivity tissue between the local payment systems and the on-chain economy. So I see a lot of potential growth in those areas. They have different use cases as USD stablecoins, but I do see that that is going to very quickly become the standard for institutions operating on chain.
Can you share your thoughts about, you guys have a stablecoin as well on the Aptos blockchain? I want to jump in. Let's just maybe jump into what is Aptos first, and then we'll dive into USD1 and the stablecoin that you're bringing to the ecosystem. But if you can share, like, it's a layer one blockchain. It seems like you guys are always focused on things like performance and consumer grade applications, which seems perfect in the kind of situation that we are in the digital asset industry. I think you're well positioned right now. But explain what Aptos is and what makes it desirable to users. There's a lot of L1 blockchains out there. Why are people coming to Aptos versus others, or along with maybe some other blockchains in the ecosystem?
Absolutely. As you mentioned, Aptos is a layer one blockchain, and the infrastructure and technology is optimized and constantly being improved with a objective of making sure it's institutional grade and ready for institutional grade applications. We're always trying to optimize how can we reduce the cost of operating on transactions, meaning how can we make sure that the gas fees and the transaction costs are as low as possible? How can we make sure that the finality and the latency of the network is as low as possible? And how can we make sure that the capacity and the throughput of the network is as high as possible? So if you think about Aptos, Aptos is always number one in all of those metrics. And we are very proud of that, because it means that we can start having conversations with institutions that are thinking about mass adoption and scaling this to billions of consumers, right? And when you think about how can you actually make that happen, it has to be in a high throughput, low cost, and instant settlement blockchain. So we're very proud of the technology and the infrastructure that we've built. And obviously one of the biggest applications that we're seeing is stablecoin and money movement on chain.
I'm actually curious, when I think about blockchains, when you mentioned a couple of their metrics there, you as a product person, is there a certain metric that keeps you up at night, maybe versus the rest of your product team? Like, what's the one thing that looks like success for you? Obviously, with so many features, you're leading in many of those features. But what's the one dearest to your heart where you're like, hey, I know we have to do great and all, but this is the one that we really need to spend our time focused on?
That's a great question. If you ask our infrastructure team or our cryptography team, they're always thinking about how can we reduce block time, settlement times. They're optimizing for very specific technical metrics. Me as a product manager, I'm constantly thinking, how can we increase transaction count? How can we increase market cap supply of stablecoins on Aptos? How can we increase assets under management or token stablecoin supply on chain? And how can we increase the number of use cases and applications using stablecoins on our network? So those are the main metrics I'm following every day. Every single week, I'm constantly monitoring to see what type of partnerships do we want to close, what type of products can we build that can have a positive impact on those metrics. And we're all working towards increasing those metrics, at least on the payments and the financial institution side of things.
What's interesting about Aptos is I believe they were founded by former engineers of Facebook, Libra, now Meta. It used to be called DM, Novi, whatever you want to name the project, which, got canceled, but technically it's basically the same, concept that we're working with today in stablecoins. How do you think the founders approach building Aptos with kind of that in the back of their mind? Was it build, towards eventually that being the use case, even though it didn't work out for Facebook?
Yes, I mean, I think it's in our DNA, right? When Libra was being built, it was being built with billions of users in their mind. I think the team was thinking about, if we're going to roll out a technology that is going to be used by the billions of users that Meta has, how can we actually make sure that it works, that it has all the capabilities and scalability and security that it needs to be able to serve not hundreds of millions, but billions of users, right? So when we talk to the team, that motto and that vision is still there. We're still thinking about having the capacity to process hundreds of millions of payments per day for billions of users without having to limit ourselves to the capacity of the network. So I think it's been since inception, and it continues to drive how we see adoption and partnering with institutions slowly and now very rapidly coming on chain.
And we're going to get into some of your specific products, but can you give me like the main use case you're seeing on Aptos today? And maybe because of stable coins and the surgence of stable coins, some of the emerging stable coin applications, or just even applications that you're seeing, or the opportunities that you've seen since the boost in stable coin infrastructure.
Absolutely. We see a lot of use cases on Aptos. I think like we could separate in different buckets, right? One of the buckets being the DeFi ecosystem, which is more managed by our ecosystem team. There's a lot of applications happening there. Then we have two of the newer products that we're launching, Shelby and Decibel. We can talk about them, but they don't really fall under the stablecoin specific track, right? Or the payment specific track. On the payment specific track, we're constantly having conversations with stablecoin issuers, stablecoin orchestration platforms, on and off ramps, exchanges that are leveraging this technology to bypass traditional banking or corresponding banking, meaning that it's being used for money movement and settlement across borders. And there's different uses for different companies, right? Like some institutions are doing it to do settlement between their entities in different countries. Some other institutions are using them for cross-border payments on a B2B side. And some institutions are even leveraging stablecoin movement for remittances, right? So a B2C approach. So we're seeing all of these use cases on Aptos. A lot of our partners give us an insight into how they're using that and how blockchain Aptos and running stablecoins on Aptos is able to contribute to a better margin, to reducing cost, to an increase in settlement speed. So yeah, I would say those are right now one of the biggest use cases that we're seeing is intra-institution settlement and cross-border payments.
And I'm curious, anyone knowing about blockchains can already see that building a L1 blockchain is not the easiest thing to do. But now you roll out your own stablecoin. What was the reasoning, the thought, the decision process around utilizing your own stablecoin? And are they the same use cases where it's more like, building out your ecosystem, and then, those members of the ecosystem can use USD1 to kind of transact, make payments, and settle?
Well, we have relationship with multiple issuers, right? We have a relationship with Tether. We have a relationship with Circle. USD1, of course, is a more recent deployment on the Aptos blockchain. We're also just announced a few weeks ago PayYUSD from PayPal and USDG from Paxos via Layer 0. So the way I see it is that stablecoins are meant to serve a specific purpose, right? And different stablecoins will have different use cases. And depending on what use cases, distribution, regions, you see different types of behavior for the usage of those stablecoins. So I can tell you that institutions, for example, are very used to using USDC and building on top of USDC. But at the same time, I can tell you that adoption in emerging markets is very heavy on USDT, right? So you see different patterns for different stablecoins, and I think that's going to continue being the case going forward. The stablecoins specifically are going to serve a specific purpose for a specific use case, and I think institutions have started to realize that, and banks. Big financial institutions are increasingly announcing that they're going to launch their own stablecoin for a specific purpose, right?
And what's interesting is that I didn't know this before researching. Aptos is probably the third largest chain for tokenized RWAs, which is real world assets. Now, I know that's not your area of expertise, but the payments infrastructure is what's driving a lot of these RWAs and everything on chain. Is that something that you think about, especially working at Aptos? Is like literally all assets might be digitalized and might be brought on chain?
Yes, that's my dream. I think that seeing every financial asset tokenized in some form will just increase capital efficiency, capital movement, reduce costs. And I think that future is not too far away, right? And my mental framework for thinking about how capital assets, real world assets, and stablecoins interact is very similar to how they interact in the traditional financial system. So if you think about the money supply, M0, you have the most narrow form of money, which is like bank deposits and circulating cash. And then you have like back deposits or treasuries, and you start going to more broader forms of money, right? And they're all different representations of value. And you could think of a world where even equity and debt are some form of cash, right? Like they're a representation of economic value. So I see it as exactly the same thing on chain. We see stablecoins as being the connectivity tissue and the most narrow form of on chain money. And then we might see other types of financial instruments like tokenized deposits, tokenized money market funds that start increasing that scope and that size of the asset classes, and the market size just starts to become bigger. But in the way you onboard into that on-chain economy and you offboard and they're trading into and trading out to is always going to be done on stablecoins. So you need that liquidity layer of stablecoins for RWA assets to actually have the utility that we think we're going to have on chain.
And if
If
you
that
could put
makes
your
sense.
regulatory, your old school policy hat on for me, what are your regulatory obligations? And has it become easier now that places like the USA, Singapore, UAE are really drawing out the blueprint for regulation in those regions when it comes to stable coins, almost DeFi, and definitely around digital asset tokenization?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Genius Act, Clarity Act, the Stablecoin Act have taken a huge step forward. Also, the MiCA framework in the European Union have given, in different ways, very clear instructions on how institutions can engage with stablecoin issuers, with stablecoins. And that sort of gives you a line of sight into what applications you can actually do and how you can engage with that. It tells you what sort of compliance you need to do around it: AML, KYC, CFT, information sharing. It's very clear that when you're dealing with digital asset or stablecoin transfer, you have to comply with transaction monitoring rules. You have to share travel rule data. And I think those frameworks are extremely useful for institutions, not because it's easy to do, right? It's still very, the technologies are still very new. Like we're still understanding how that interacts with the traditional financial system frameworks. But what it gives you is a lot of clarity on how you can engage and how you can do things. And I think that's very quickly migrating into other asset classes. So RWAs are starting to have more clarity on who can actually sell or distribute or trade digital assets that have been tokenized on chain, or real world assets that have been tokenized. And I think that clarity is just going to continue to increase as time moves forward. So
I'm curious from like a product perspective, taking off your regulatory hat and putting back on your product hat. What are some internal maybe constraints or trade-offs? You're building one of the best payments focused L1s. What are some of the trade-offs of like focusing on that? Could it be like maybe the price of Aptos, or the way security functions? Are there internal trade-offs that you want to demystify or that nobody ever sees when you're building like almost like a payment first blockchain?
I think there's, on the infrastructure side, I don't think there's a lot of trade-offs, right? Like the infrastructure serves for it's capable enough to serve a lot of purposes and a lot of volume and very high throughput. So like you can do payments, you can do trading, you can do so many things on the technology that the trade-offs are not really on that front. I see many of the trade-offs of there's so much to build, so many applications, so many controls, so many messaging standards, compliance features that we need to build to get up to speed at par with the traditional financial system, because we have a better technology for settlement and moving money, but it doesn't mean that we have better technology for routing those payments. It doesn't mean that we have a better technology on communicating who the parties on a transaction are. We don't have better technology on increasing the privacy. So I think the trade-offs are like, what do we actually build that is most useful for institutions so that their willingness to transition to this new technology is higher, right? And I see those trade-offs as being the things I'm constantly thinking about. And when we're speaking to partners, like they're the ones telling us like, oh, this is amazing. Like I would love to start doing stablecoin payments, but I'm very used to sending my information and routing my payments through Swift. Then how can I do that in Aptos? How can I do that with a stablecoin? And the reality is we still have to mature and make sure that those routing mechanisms, that information is standardized in a way that is at par with the traditional financial system. So I think some of those trade-offs are what I look at and what I'm thinking about as product manager in the space.
How do you decide? There's been so much hype, to your point about digital assets back in 2021. There's been so much hype. We went from NFTs to the metaverse to, I remember soulbound tokens and security token offerings. Now RWA, staking, meme coins. How do you decide on where to allocate your resources and efforts? And how do you decide like, hey, we still have to meet our customers where they are, even if this is hype, but we also have to focus long-term and sustainability of some of these projects and applications. How do you balance that from a product side?
That's a great question. And it's a dilemma we have all the time, right? Like one, you have to make sure you're meeting your customers' needs on what they need today. And the other one is sort of understanding what they're going to need in the future and working with them to map out what is going to come next. So it takes a lot of work, a lot of conversations, a lot of back and forth. We're involved in a lot of working groups. For example, we're part of the Faster Payment Council that is constantly thinking about like, how can we make sure that we can achieve faster payments at a lower cost? And this is where we are seeing the industry go towards. So you have to see some of those long-term vision from different people that have a lot of experience in the space and that understand where the industry is currently at and how it's maturing in order to be able to select all the pieces of the puzzle and make sure you make the right trade-offs. But it comes from a lot of iteration, a lot of conversations with potential customers, and a lot of shipping and building and testing with partners to see if it meets their needs, right? Like sometimes we build things that are not necessarily what they need today, but hopefully it's a product that they're going to be using in the future. So
have you thought of a product and feature that you might have launched in the past that customers weren't going raving about, but they, realized how important infrastructurally it was, now that we have it like basically stable coin hype and usage and infrastructure?
yeah. So I've always been a huge proponent of on-chain compliance. I think there's so much to build that as a layer one, we can bake into the protocol, into the network that facilitates compliance for the parties interacting with it. And we still haven't shipped anything specifically. We have a couple of PRDs internally that we want to build to facilitate on-chain compliance and make it easier for institutions to interact on-chain. So I'm hoping that's one of the things we're able to build in the future. Where I've been spending the most time for the past 8 months is building a protocol for improving in-person payments. So it's one of the things that we haven't really seen take off. we haven't seen a mass adoption of stablecoins for in-person payments or e-commerce. And I think that there's a massive opportunity to build something that facilitates that. If you try to go to pay with stablecoins at your local coffee shop or at your local grocery store, it's most likely that it's not going to be possible. Even if you go to a very crypto-friendly merchant, it still takes you 9 taps, 10 taps in your screen or clicks to be able to find the right QR code to send the assets. And when you compare that to traditional payments in person, there's a drastic difference in the user experience. So I think there's a very big opportunity to reducing that difference and making sure that in-person payments using new rails and new technologies is as seamless as it can be with a credit card, for example.
And that's why I think we're seeing an influx of crypto payment cards because of that, maybe that UX issue. If you can't pay as easy as you can at Starbucks, people don't seem to, or Apple Pay, people don't seem to want it as much these days.
Absolutely.
You talked a little bit about the nuances of, product side versus like even things like on-chain compliance, but you've been based both in Mexico and in the US. Are there any unique differences building in the Latin market like you were at Bitso, or even places like Africa as an engineer, based versus like someone that is an engineer in the US? They may not understand some of those nuances of those regions. Have you noticed some nuances, even from like an engineering and product side, not even just like a regulatory side?
I think the reality is I think those nuances come more on the use case side. For example, in the US, a lot of the use cases and institutions are thinking about payments outside the US, right? So like paying from the US to other countries, stablecoins facilitates that process to basically a single transfer. In other countries, for example, in Mexico and Argentina, you see the inverse operation, right? Like receiving stablecoins, converting them to the local fiat currency. And the use case is different, and the mindset of building towards that is a little bit different. And also, for example, in emerging markets, stablecoins are being used as basically digital dollar bank accounts, right? So there's a different mindset of the type of use cases and how you build around the technology. But the reality is the core of it all is basically the same. So I wouldn't see a lot of difference between how people are seeing the technology in one place or the other. It's more about the application of it.
Even blockchains need to have you mentioned the ecosystem, a tight partnership ecosystem of industry players. It seems like you guys have obtained that with like Google Cloud and Microsoft and MasterCard. Can you share some insights on what makes a good partnership, especially from like a product side for you? And, are there certain types of companies that you're looking to partner with, going into 2026 and with the emergence of crypto payments and stablecoins?
Yes, absolutely. So 2025 has been a lot of partnerships that we think were essential to start building connectivity around different regions. We started partnering with companies in Africa and Southeast Asia, in Latin America, to make sure that Aptos is present in a lot of countries. And we start building that fiat connectivity that is needed for cross-border payments, for remittances, for building that liquidity. And 2026 is a year that we want to continue doubling down on that, and where we want to start partnering with more brand name institutions, right? So you asked me what makes a good partnership, and from a product perspective, for me, a good partnership means we're both going to be investing resources, time, and money into a partnership. I want to make sure that I'm building something for you that is useful for you, but I want to make sure that you're spending the proper time on giving me feedback, on making sure you're talking to your own customers and telling me whether the technology is serving their needs. So I think a partnership with an institution has the objective of creating synergies between the two of them, right? And the only way you can create those synergies is by communicating the benefits of what they're bringing to the table, what you're bringing to the table, and how can you add 1 + 1 so that it equals 3 and not 2, right?
And I'm curious. I looked on your website. You guys got a lot going on. You have Aptos Connect, Ascend. You have something called Geomi. you have Petra Wallet. Can you maybe give us some high level, maybe some of your the features that you and the products that you've had your hand in, and what are the main users doing with those products?
Yeah, absolutely. I think all of those products that you're mentioning are key primitives and essential components of the ecosystem. Those are things that have specifically built in-house to serve the ecosystem. So, for example, you mentioned keyless, right? Keyless is infrastructure that allows you to abstract away the need of creating or storing seed phrases for creating wallets and simplifying the process of being able to create an Aptos account to a single click or a single login. For example, Geomi is a lot of technology and infrastructure aimed towards developers so that they can interact, create smart contracts, create processes, index data in a better, faster, simpler way, specifically built for the Aptos blockchain. So a lot of the things and products you mentioned are aimed towards developers and institutions so that they can leverage as much of the infrastructure that we're building so that they can build their own custom products in a very easy and seamless way on top of our blockchain.
You know, Aptos talks a lot about this concept like the next financial internet in blogs, mentioning on-chain finance and TAPT, TAPT, the Aptos authentication protocol. Can you describe what does the next financial internet look like to you from a product side, and maybe where some of these protocols fit into this?
Yeah, I think our CEO, Avery, is constantly talking about the global trading engine and how that global trading engine means that every asset is going to be able to be traded on chain and it's going to have a digital or on chain representation. And we are hard believers that that's going to happen. And that's what we're seeing. Those are the patterns that we're seeing. From my perspective and my lens, that means, for example, Tapped, which is the product that we've been working on, that a lot of the payments are going to be replaced by new rails. So we're making sure that we're thinking about like how does loyalty and rewards systems that have been very siloed between their own companies. Like think about like airlines. They have their own loyalty programs, but they don't interact with the loyalty programs of coffee shops, right? But they share a same vertical, which is they're all a payment-backed system. So what we're trying to build is a payment system that allows for the interoperability of all these things in a single interaction. So making sure that when you grab your phone and you pay at a POS system, you're able to use your rewards from one place, you're able to cash back at the same time and pay in whatever asset you want to be paying in. Without the merchant having to deal with all the complexities of understanding if it's a stable coin, if it's a reward, so we're trying to simplify that to a single interaction. The same way you do with a credit card payment, but doing it fully on chain with new rails, with the speed and efficiency that you get from using stablecoins.
You know, you have billions of dollars. You talk a lot about the institutions and the enterprises using Aptos. You have billions of dollars on chain. What are some of the lessons learned from like these institutions, especially around building tokenized products? And what does that mean for the future of digital assets? Like there must be some lessons learned when you're trying to onboard billions of fiat dollars into a digitalized, tokenized world. What are some lessons that you've learned from a product side?
I think, yeah, that's a great question. One of the learnings I've seen is that the industry has still a lot to do to simplify onboarding institutions and people onto this new digital economy. We've done great progress. If you remember, like 10 years ago, you wanted to start using crypto and stablecoins didn't even exist. It was very complicated. right? Like it was almost impossible. It felt like you were hacking a computer, just getting an address so you could do a transfer. And the industry has been improving the user experience. It has been improving the product and simplifying and abstracting away many of those complexities. But I think there's still a lot of work to do in order for financial institutions to actually adopt it at a mass scale, right? Right now, as you mentioned, we're seeing billions in volume. We're seeing every month, we're seeing billions in market cap and stablecoins and Aptos. But I think there's the capacity of that turning into trillions in volume and hundreds of billions in market supply. But in order for that to happen, institutions have to feel that it's so easy to integrate, that it's so easy and interoperable with their systems, that you abstract away all the complexities of having to deal with key signatures, with key rotation, with security. Like they need to feel like this is almost as easy as their existing systems, but better, right? And I think that's one of the learnings I have. The more we build towards simplifying and improving the user experience for end users, customers, and institutions, the faster we're going to start seeing adoption.
Speaking of speed, you're working on the product side, you're always about shipping product and shipping features, but there's a whole ecosystem of L1 blockchains, especially now with stablecoins being the focal point and a lot of capital being poured into stablecoin infrastructure. How do you maintain, like, hey, we have to deal with this a certain way. We're onboarding billions of dollars for financial institutions from around the world. We can't go too fast and break things. We can't use the Facebook or some of the Apple mantras in order to help onboard those next million or billion of people that you're talking about. So how do you balance seeing competitors in the space, companies that move fast but die out? Like, how do you keep that noise out and focus, but also still meeting a certain speed level that you can better support and service your customers?
It's a great question. I love the idea of moving fast, break things, and then figuring out how you can fix those things. But the reality is, when we're talking about money, when we're talking about a financial infrastructure, that is not the case. Finance and financial institutions are one of the most regulated institutions, and they're regulated for a reason, right? They're regulated so heavily because the regulation is trying to protect consumers. Institutions are dealing with the livelihoods and the money of millions of individuals across the globe. And when you're building with that in mind, you have to be very mindful that everything you ship is very tightly audited, that everything you ship is very in compliance, that has certain standards in terms of security, in terms of protecting the consumer. So I think it's definitely different. It's a different nature. It's not the same building a tech product that you can launch and you can let people test without actually making sure that everything is tightly, than if you're going to deploy a stablecoin contract, right? That is going to have millions or billions in market cap, that a hacker or someone cannot exploit that contract to remove funds from people. So I think I'm very pro regulation in that sense, making sure that regulation keeps a certain standard and make sure that consumers remain protected. But obviously, it's also very important to ship fast, to make sure that you're keeping up with competitors, because it's a very competed space. So
I guess there's a little difference. Like if Facebook's shipping Farmville or image tagging, that's different than other people's money. That's when the regulators really care. When you start losing other people's money versus
yeah,
maybe your own market share or your own big company's money or tech stack's money. I'm
absolutely.
curious. We talked a little bit about what the current state of stablecoins is. We had somebody on the podcast that was saying like, yeah, stablecoins are great, but eventually, consumers are going to want more, especially when a lot of these stable coins are pegged to a fiat dollar that might go down in value, and it, essentially has gone down in value over the last decade or 20 years. What are your thoughts on that? Like people getting away from stable, like you're not going to see too many Argentinian backed peso stable coins just because that value will go down. and people are looking at the US in the same way. What are your thoughts about that? Do you think about that, or you're pretty safe and like we still need to move money based on the value of the US dollar and other countries' dollar, as you stated before?
That's a great question. I think while the US dollar continues being the reserve currency of the world, I think US dollar stablecoins will continue being the predominant share of the pie, right? Like, I don't see that changing anytime soon. But what I do see is a lot of use cases and will depend on non-USD stablecoins or like Mexican peso backed, Brazilian real backed, or Turkish lira backed stablecoins. And one of the use cases that I'm a firm believer is going to come on chain, and there's a lot of complexities in solving that and making that happen, but is on chain FX. I'm a huge proponent that the FX markets will come on chain, and for that to be a reality, it requires non-USD stablecoins. Now, as you mentioned, are the use cases for an Argentinian peso backed stablecoin going to be the same for than a US dollar stablecoin? Of course not. I think they're going to have different use cases. I think local fiat stablecoins are going to be the connectivity tissue to the financial system. At the end of the day, governments will always want their currency to be used in their jurisdiction, right? Like if you go to Mexico, there's a law that makes it obligatory for you to pay in Mexican pesos because governments want their currency to be used. So I think that's not going to change in the long term. I think that non-USD stablecoins will have use in the economy, and there's always going to be space for that. But I think if you look at the total monetary mass of the world, like the US dollar has a very big composition of the total money supply. And maybe the euro or the renminbi have different market caps in the fiat world. I think we're going to see something very similar in going on into the on-chain economy. I don't know how much time it's going to take, but
just even talking about, when we went back to like shipping fast, like how much are you utilizing AI? There's been tons of reports and concerns around using AI in smart contracts and the vulnerabilities and exploits that's happened because of that. You're dealing with traditional financial institutions, and you even said like, hey, we can leverage a lot from what the traditional financial ecosystem is doing right, which is usually based around security. So what are your thoughts about utilizing AI or using it more so to expedite things internally, like whether it's redundant tasks versus using it on some of the code that might be visible externally?
So I think we're very careful with what we actually put on the smart contracts and make sure that that has been audited, that has been reviewed by the people that actually know what's going on there. But in order to ship, iterate, ideate, we're using AI very much, right? Like we're constantly thinking about like creating mock-ups, creating APIs, and for that, AI is an incredible tool. You can actually build demos in hours instead of days, or show a partner how to potentially use their product or how it would interact with their product, and a couple lines of code and a couple of prompts, and you have something that you can show your customer without actually having to build the full product demo for it, right? So in that sense, AI is incredibly useful. When you're shipping institutional grade things and you're testing everything, I think that's when we're being more careful. And I think we still have a very strong engineering team that's doing that. Yeah, I think that answers a little bit your question.
What's the talent pool like? Like you're managing, you're hiring people. You obviously, when big projects come up, you have to bring in talent. It seems like talent is scarce. A lot of talent's going over to AI tech companies versus staying in blockchain. What do you think the talent pool is like? What makes a good person that's building product in crypto? What are some of the characteristics of somebody that wants to get into product management in the blockchain space?
Great question. I think to be able, at least where I'm building and where I'm focusing my time, which is payments, money movement, financial infrastructure, some of those skills you need is to understand like what are the needs of financial institutions. So a lot of the product managers come from either traditional financial institutions or from fintechs, because that gives you also some level of experience of understanding like what are the regulatory constraints of building in technology, like what are the compliance features that you have to build in, or the compliance integrations that you have to build in. Even just thinking about like, are you in the flow of funds? Are you not in the flow of funds? Are you building custodial, non-custodial? Like some of those have very big implications when you're building a product and you're shipping something. So I think having a little bit of experience of how the traditional financial system, it gives you a tremendous edge in being able to be a product manager, not only in crypto, but specifically in the payment space in crypto, right?
How much are you able to pull data and intelligence? I'm thinking like, hey, you're seeing the rails, you're seeing the inflows, you're seeing the outflows, and this is companies are playing on very slight margins when it comes into especially financial ecosystems and the TradFi especially. Are you able to gather data like, hey, we're seeing a rise of inflows into Mexico and outflows to Europe, and these are some of the insights we can provide to our clients, and maybe even spin it off into a separate product altogether where companies are looking for these edges. They're looking for the competitive advantage in order to get into the not just the stablecoin market, but in order to be compete in the payments market.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm constantly thinking and working with our head of data science in our company, trying to come up with those insights and understanding where the flows are coming from, what type of institutions, where the money is going from. But as you can imagine, like even though the data on blockchain is completely transparent and everyone can see it, actually being able to get actionable insights is still complicated. And we work with a lot of data providers who help us do tagging, who help us do transaction analysis, because you need to build that labeling, you need to build that. So it requires a lot of effort in order to be able to gain some of those insights. It's not like Web 2. It's much more complicated in the Web3 space to be able to get some of those insights, and it requires more work. And I think data providers, compliance companies are doing a massive effort in making sure that some of those things become as easy as Web 2.
And are there blockchain analytics companies that you work with that have kind of like traced the Aptos blockchain and able to spot illicit activity or abnormal activity, suspicious activity, or more importantly, attribute certain players on your ecosystem? So as companies come in and utilize or build on top of your L1 blockchain, they can see some of the transparency of the Aptos blockchain.
Yeah, absolutely. Like we're supported by some of the biggest blockchain data providers. We're supported by some of the major compliance companies doing analytics, monitoring, sanction screening. So all of that becomes transparent as institutions come with their own tools and say like, hey, I'm using XY provider for some of my stablecoin and crypto transactions. Can I do it with Aptos blockchain? And we're like, yeah, absolutely. We've been collaborating with the XY company on tagging certain addresses, on making sure that we have visibility on this front. So yeah, I mean, that's one of the benefits of having a technology that's as open and as transparent. I don't know if you would agree with that.
No, I think I'm a compliance and former blockchain investigator. So even if there's not illicit activity, I'm visual. So I love to see the way the ecosystem is, not just crypto addresses and obscurity. I'm curious. You mentioned a lot about Paxos and building within certain organizations. The global dollar network seems to be getting a lot of traction, especially around stablecoins. What is the global dollar network, and what is the driver behind Aptos contributing or getting involved in those type of initiatives?
So I'm probably not the best person to talk about the global dollar network, but what I see from the outside, and one of the reasons we're very excited about having USDG issued by Paxos and in collaboration with Layer Zero on Aptos, is that they have a different value proposition and they have a different use case to other stablecoins. And one of the main advantages of USDG and the global dollar network is that there is a more equitable distribution of the earnings of the reserves that are backing that stablecoin. So a lot of the partners get shares and redistribution of the underlying interests of those reserves, which makes it very, very attractive for a couple of institutions. And I think that's why you've seen a global dollar network grow from a couple of companies to, I think they've crossed the threshold of over 100 companies over the past year or so. So as I was mentioning in the beginning, I think stablecoins are going to be use case specific. And I think USDG is a stablecoin that is very well positioned for institutional adoption and has the right incentives for players who want to build on stablecoins to want to participate by using that.
Any huge announcements from your side coming? I know you can't tell much. You're on the product side, so you have to be very tight-lipped. But anything you're excited about, Aptos, whether it's, the emergence of real-world asset tokenization, anything others, things that you're seeing interesting, maybe staking getting more limelight than it did a couple of years ago. Anything interesting within Aptos or what people are building on Aptos, or anything in the industry overall going into 2026?
So in October, we had two big announcements. Three big announcements. We announced Shelby, which is our decentralized storage solution. I'm extremely, extremely excited to see that go into testnet and mainnet in 2026. Same with Decibel, which is currently on testnet. I'm very excited, and I know the product manager for that product really well. I'm very excited for Decibel to come into mainnet. I think that's going to bring a huge amount of activity. But on the other hand, I also work very closely with our business development team, with our chief business officer and our head of capital markets. And the type of relationships, conversations, and potential partnerships that they're driving is extremely exciting for me. It's institutions that 10 years ago I would have never dreamed of seeing on chain. And now we're actually having very real conversations with them about how do we tokenize X, Y, and Z assets and bring it on chain. And I think that's going to be an influx of billions and billions of assets into Aptos. And that, without mentioning any specific names, gets me very, very excited.
Is there anything you think shouldn't be on chain, just by the sheer of the complexities and the nuances, whether it's on chain compliance, as you said, whether it's just a technology stack behind it? Is there anything you're like, hey, that should definitely be left off chain? It isn't worth it trying to bring it on chain.
Well, one thing that I'm very convinced, and I've always been convinced that should be left on chain, is a publicly identifiable information, even if it's encrypted. I don't think that should ever be on chain. Why? Because if for some reason there's some encryption improvement or quantum computer improvement that can decrypt those encoded messages, then you have a massive leakage of data, right? So I think PII needs to transform into digital identity, into other forms of KYC and information sharing. So I've always been a proponent of trying to leave that off chain so that we're not open to massive data breaches. Even though I don't think Web2 standards or fintech standards are the way to go, right? But I think that personal information should continue staying off chain for the time being.
From a person that works in product in crypto, Web3, you're looking at a DeFi, RWAs, payments, stablecoins. Is there any books or podcasts that you help keep you up to date with what's going on in the industry, or you just learn by fire? You're in the fire every day, so you know exactly what the heat is. Give me some ideas of anything you consume outside of Aptos, or even maybe within Aptos, but not necessarily with what you're building.
I'm constantly reading industry reports, and that's, in the beginning when I first joined crypto, I remember reading every single book about crypto that there was. One of my favorite one continues to be the the book by Andrea Konstantopoulos. Let me do a quick search. Andrea's Bitcoin book. Okay. So one of my favorite books when I joined the crypto industry was a book called Mastering Bitcoin. And when I read that book, it blew my mind. I was like, wow, like I can actually understand how the technology works. I think there's a similar book for Mastering Ethereum, Mastering Smart Contracts. So like those books are absolutely amazing for understanding the technology. What I read most of the time and whenever there's a new report being issued, either by consulting firms, by big payments companies, by data providers, I'm reading those reports every single time that I have an opportunity with a 2025 volumes, with a perspective for 2026, because a lot of companies do a lot of research and a lot of work in speaking with potential customers and asking this same question, like, hey, what do you see is going to happen in 2026? And when you aggregate all that information, I think you get a very good outline and outlook of what's going to happen. So I spend a lot of time reading some of those industry reports. And it gives me a good insight of and validation of what are we working on and what's coming next.
It's funny that that book brought you more insight. That book made me realize that maybe the technical side of crypto is definitely not for me. I mean, I went back to his like Internet of Money books. I'm like, okay, tell me about traditional finance and why crypto's a little bit better. I don't understand the code that you're writing in. Bob and Alice do not make sense at this stage for me.
There's another book that I was recently recommended and started reading that I'm loving called The Anatomy of a Swipe. That is a book that is helping me understand what are some of the hurdles and problems in the payment space and with traditional cards, and how can we make sure that we improve that with new technology. So that's one that's currently on my nightstand.
Emilio, the podcast doesn't always get the opportunity to sit down with product focused people that have a regulatory background. So this was definitely a treat. You covered all the bases, and you gave us a really great look into like what it's like building some of these products and features. Where's the best place for people to find you? Are you spending more time on LinkedIn, Twitter? Do you have a medium that you're still, writing, even though maybe not that many people are on that platform? Where can people find you?
People can find me both on LinkedIn and on Twitter. Emilio Coello is my username for most of my platforms. And I'm always happy and open to chat with people in the industry wanting to learn. And I want to thank you, Stephen. Like, this has been super interesting. Thank you for having me and hosting me. And I hope I get a chance to get invited for another topic, maybe.
I'm excited. I want to say maybe at the end of 2026, we'll be able to do a recap of what we talked about today, which is, I can only imagine how much will change and evolve until then. But I'm excited to talk to you again, Emilio.
Likewise. Thank you so much, Stephen.
Appreciate it.